The auctioneer had a voice like gravel dragged across dry wood, and he used it without apology. Next lot, female, 18 years, able-bodied. Evelyn Hart had promised herself she would not look at the crowd. She broke that promise within the first 10 seconds. There were maybe 40 men gathered in the dirt lot beside the Dry Creek feed store, and they stood the way men stand when they believe they have already decided something, arms crossed, weight back, eyes flat with ownership. A few whispered to each other. One laughed at something she couldn't hear. She made herself look at a spot above their heads, a place where the sky was doing nothing more threatening than being blue, and she focused on that. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them against the sides of her dress. The dress had been her mother's once. She had taken it from the trunk 3 days ago when she realized what was going to happen, thinking she would rather be sold in something clean than in the work clothes she'd lived in for the past month. Now the dress felt like a mistake. It was too careful, too deliberate, as if she were trying. The auctioneer droned on about her. He said things she didn't fully hear, something about health, something about experience with livestock and household management. She wondered when she had become a list of useful qualities rather than a person with a name. Her father's debts had done that. Thomas Hart had been a dreamer in a land that did not reward dreaming. He had borrowed against the homestead in seasons of hope and failed to repay in seasons of drought, and when the bank finally lost patience, the whole thing came apart in less than a month. The land went first, then the cattle, then the tools and the wagon and the 2 horses she had named as a girl. Her father had been dead by the time the last of it was settled, and she had been left with the debts he couldn't take with him and no living relation who would take her in. The county had arranged the rest. She had not consented to be here, but she had also understood that her consent was not the point. "We'll open at $15, the auctioneer said. 15. She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together. A few hands went up, lazy and disinterested. The bidding climbed without urgency. 22, 25. A heavy-set man near the fence raised his number to 30, and the men around him nudged each other like he'd done something funny. She'd seen that man before, in town, and she could not remember his name, but she remembered how he'd looked at her in the general store once, and she felt the back of her neck go cold. 32, 35. She was going to the heavy-set man. She could feel it the way you feel a door swinging shut. The momentum was there, slow and final, and no one was going to stop it. Then a voice came from the back. $120. Everything stopped. Not just the bidding, the breathing, the shuffling, the lazy murmur of men deciding things. All of it went quiet at once, the way a field goes quiet when something passes through the tall grass. Evelyn turned her head. He was standing at the far edge of the crowd, and he had not raised a number or made any gesture besides speaking. He was tall and weathered in the way that didn't come from vanity, but from years spent working in the open, his face drawn and unhurried, his hat brim low enough that she couldn't read his expression at the distance. He was looking at the auctioneer, not at her, and the absence of that attention was strange enough that she noticed it. The auctioneer recovered first. $120, he repeated, as if he needed to hear it again himself. Do I hear 125? The heavy-set man at the fence had lowered his number. He was looking at the tall man the same way everyone else was looking at him, not with anger exactly, but with the careful recalibration of men who had expected a simple afternoon and now found it complicated. Nobody else bid. Sold, the auctioneer said, and struck the board, and that was that. She didn't know his name until one of the county men walked her over and said, too cheerfully, Wyatt Mercer's got himself a housekeeper, like it was a piece of news he'd been saving. Wyatt Mercer. She turned the name over in her head while they stood through the paperwork portion of the transaction, which took longer than she expected and felt both too formal and not formal enough. He signed something. She signed something. Someone pressed a copy into her hands, and she took it without looking at it. He didn't speak to her directly through any of this. He spoke to the county man and then to another man in a dark vest who seemed to be some kind of administrator, and she stood slightly to one side and felt the specific humiliation of being managed without being addressed. When the paperwork was done, he looked at her for the first time. He was older than she'd expected from the voice alone, maybe 40, maybe a few years past. His eyes were a pale, tired gray, and they looked at her the same way they had presumably looked at everything else today, without excess, without performance. The eyes of a man who had learned not to react to things until he decided what he thought of them. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Mercer. The wagon's across the road. I'd like to be back before dark if we can manage it." That was all. He turned and walked, and she understood she was meant to follow, and so she did. The wagon was a working vehicle, not a comfortable one. The seat was hard and the springs were minimal, and the road out of Dry Creek was rutted in a way that suggested the town had long since given up on maintaining it. She sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap and watched the outskirts of town give way to open country. He drove without conversation. She was grateful for that mostly, though the silence had a weight to it that made her aware of everything she didn't know. Where she was going, what was expected of her, what kind of man this was who spent $120 on a stranger and then spoke fewer than 20 words to her afterward. After perhaps 2 miles, she decided that asking was better than wondering. "What is it you need from me?" He didn't answer immediately. She had the impression he was used to thinking before speaking, and that this was not a flaw in him, but simply how he was built. "I've got 2 children," he said finally. "Twins, 12 years old. The house needs managing and they need looking after, and I can't do it the way it ought to be done while also running the ranch." "What happened to the last person who looked after them?" He was quiet again. "She left." "Before her?" "There were 3. They all left." She looked at the road ahead. "What did the children do?" This time she thought she saw something move at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement. "What didn't they do?" he said. The Mercer Ranch came into view in the late afternoon, when the sun was doing that thing it did on the frontier where it turned everything the color of old copper and made even the ugliest land look like something worth keeping. She saw the main house first, a solid, undecorated structure of wood and stone that had been built to last rather than to impress. Beyond it, a barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings in various states of repair. Fencing that stretched out until it stopped making sense against the landscape. It was more than she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something smaller, maybe. Something that matched the quietness of the man beside her. 2 figures appeared in the yard as the wagon pulled in. And even from a distance, she could tell they were taking stock of her, the way you take stock of something you're not sure you want. The children were dark-haired and square-jawed, the girl slightly taller than the boy, both of them standing with the same posture, shoulders set, chins level, not moving toward the wagon and not moving away from it. She climbed down without waiting to be helped. She figured if she started waiting to be helped, she'd spend the rest of her life waiting. "Abigail, Eli," Wyatt didn't raise his voice. "This is Miss Evelyn Hart. She'll be staying on with us." The girl, Abigail, looked at her directly and said nothing. The look was very complete in its nothing. The boy said, "We don't need her." "Go wash up for supper," Wyatt said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Abigail turned and walked toward the house, and Eli followed her, and neither of them looked back. Wyatt began unhitching the horses. "The room at the end of the hall," he said. "Your trunk should be in there already. Clara, she's the cook, comes 3 days a week. She'll have supper on within the hour." "Mr. Mercer." He paused. "I want to be clear about something," she said. She hadn't planned this, but she'd been thinking about it the whole drive out, and she thought it was better said now than later. "I'm not interested in being treated like furniture. I'll do the work. I'll look after your children to the best of my ability, but I have a name, and I'd like it used." He looked at her with those pale, tired eyes and said, "I know your name." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." He went back to the horses. She went inside. The room was at the end of the hall, as promised. It was small and clean and had a window that looked out over the north fence and a bit of open ground beyond. There was a bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a hook on the back of the door. Her trunk, what was left of it, her few things collected by the county before the auction, sat at the foot of the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress and did not cry. She had cried enough in the past month to last her several years, and she had made herself a kind of rule about it. Not because crying was weakness, but because she had discovered that once she started, it became very difficult to stop, and she couldn't afford to be undone right now. She thought about her father, which she was still getting used to doing in the past tense. She thought about the homestead. She thought about the morning she was 7 years old and her father had let her name one of the new calves. and she'd named it August because it was born in August, and she'd thought that was clever at the time. She thought about these things for exactly long enough to feel them, and then she put them away. Then she unpacked her trunk with the efficiency of someone who has learned that belonging to a place starts with putting your things in it, even a place you didn't choose. Supper was served in a large kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and something onion-based, and the four of them sat at a table that was clearly designed for more people than were currently using it. Clara, who turned out to be a compact woman in her 50s with the air of someone who had seen a great deal and had stopped being surprised by any of it, had made a beef stew that was considerably better than it needed to be. The twins ate, Wyatt ate, Evelyn ate. Nobody spoke. She let it go on for a while, then decided silence was exactly the wrong strategy. "This is good stew," she said. "What's in it?" Clara looked at her from the doorway. "The usual. Carrots, potato, what was left of the chuck." "Is there rosemary? I thought I tasted something." "Thyme," Clara said, "from the garden out back. If you're interested in the kitchen, I'll show you what we have." "I'd appreciate that." She glanced at the twins. Eli was staring at his bowl with the focused attention of someone determined not to participate. Abigail was looking at her with that same flat, evaluating look she'd had in the yard. "I like to cook," Evelyn said, to no one in particular. Abigail said, "The last one said that too. She burned everything." "Which one was she?" Abigail blinked. That wasn't the response she'd expected. "Second one," she said after a pause. "And the others?" "First one left because Eli put a snake in her bed." She said this without embarrassment, almost like a recitation. "Third one?" "She didn't last long enough to try cooking." "What did you do to her?" "Nothing," Eli said, still not looking up. "She just didn't like us." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I suppose that's possible," she said. "It's also possible she didn't try hard enough." Eli finally looked up. "Which do you think?" Evelyn asked him directly. He was 12 and he was smart. She could see that in about 4 seconds. He was the kind of smart that had already started to become a chip on his shoulder, which meant someone along the way had taught him that intelligence was armor rather than just a quality. "Both," he said. "Fair," she said. "I'll try harder than she did. You can put a snake in my bed if you want, but I grew up on a homestead, and I'll just put it back outside. I'd rather save the drama for something worth it." Clara made a small sound from the doorway that might have been a suppressed laugh. Wyatt said nothing, but she caught him looking at her from across the table, and the look was different from the one he'd given her in town. She couldn't quite name it. She let it go. Mshot. That first week was more testing than she'd been prepared for, and she'd told herself to expect a great deal. Eli's campaign was frontal. He broke things, lost things, moved things, and then looked at her with wide, innocent eyes that were not innocent at all. On Tuesday, he accidentally left the gate to the hen yard open, and she spent an hour rounding up chickens with him watching from the fence, with his arms crossed. "You're going to help," she said, not asking. "I don't think so." "Then we're going to be out here a lot longer than we need to be." He helped. Abigail's approach was more surgical. She was quieter about it, which made it harder. She would complete her assigned chores almost perfectly, and then leave out exactly one thing, the one thing that mattered. And when Evelyn pointed it out, Abigail would look at her with an expression that said, "Prove it was deliberate." On Wednesday night, Evelyn found that someone had folded all the clean laundry incorrectly. Not badly, not carelessly, but in a slightly different method than she'd shown them, precise enough to have required effort. She unfolded it and refolded it and said nothing. Thursday morning, Abigail was in the kitchen before anyone else, standing at the window with a cup of cold water. "You didn't say anything," Abigail said. "About what?" "The laundry." "It was done," Evelyn said. "It just needed to be redone." "That's not how the last ones were." Evelyn reached past her for the coffee pot. "What did they do?" "Screamed at us. Told father. One of them grabbed my arm." Abigail said this last one very flatly, and Evelyn heard everything underneath it. She poured her coffee and stood there for a moment. "I'm not going to grab your arm," she said. "I'm also not going to pretend everything's fine when it isn't. But I'm not going anywhere, so you might as well tell me how you actually like the laundry done." Abigail looked at her for a long time. "We fold the shirts flat," she said finally. "Mother did it that way." "Then that's how we'll do it." It was not a thaw. It was more like the first perceptible shift, so small you might miss it if you weren't watching. But Evelyn was watching. At the end of the first week, she found Eli in the barn past supper, sitting in the loft with a book and a lantern that was dangerously close to the hay. "Move the lantern," she said. He moved it. That was something. She climbed up. The loft ladder was steeper than it needed to be, she noted, and sat a few feet from him. He pulled the book slightly toward himself, obscuring the cover. "What are you reading?" "Nothing." "You're reading something with a lot of words in it." He gave up hiding it. It was a worn copy of something about natural science, the pages marked up in pencil. She could see faint annotations in the margins, written small. "Did you write in it?" she asked. "Yes." "What kind of things?" He looked at her with the suspicion he was always carrying. "Notes, arguments, things I think are wrong." "You think a published book is wrong?" "Sometimes." He paused. "Are you going to tell me I shouldn't?" "No," she said. "If you've got a reason for it." He didn't say anything for a while. She didn't push. Then he said, "There's a chapter on migratory patterns, and it's completely off. I've been watching the birds on this property for 2 years, and the timing's different. I wrote to the author, but he never wrote back." "You wrote to the author?" "He was probably dead," Eli said, with the candor of a 12-year-old who hadn't learned to soften things. "The book's old." She almost smiled. "What do you think the right timing is?" He looked at her, trying to assess whether she was mocking him or actually asking. "I have notes," he said. "I'd like to see them," she said. And this, not the smile, not the warmth, not the careful management, this was the thing that actually reached him. Not being handled, being taken seriously. He closed the science book and picked up a different notebook from behind his knee. He opened it to a page dense with observations organized by date, and he began to talk about birds. She listened for over an hour. The lantern burned low. Outside, the ranch settled into night sounds. She didn't see Wyatt for the better part of that first week, except at meals, where he ate in the same manner he did most things, present but not intrusive. He asked the children about their days in brief, direct questions and received brief, direct answers. He thanked Clara when she came. He nodded at Evelyn when she spoke. On Friday evening, he caught her on the porch after supper, coming in from the barn while she was sitting in the one chair that faced west. "How are you finding it?" he said. "Hard," she said. "Fair, but hard." He leaned against the post. "They haven't driven you off?" "Not yet. That's longer than most." She looked at him. "Mr. Mercer, can I ask you something?" He waited. "Why did you do it?" "At the auction. That kind of money. You don't know me. You didn't know what you were getting." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. The sky had gone that deep violet gray of early evening, and the first stars were just starting to show up. "I knew what I was looking at," he said finally. "I'd seen it before. Someone standing somewhere they shouldn't have to stand." He stopped, started again differently. "My wife, when she died 2 years ago, I told myself I was managing. The kids were managing." He shook his head just slightly. "We weren't managing. I needed help, and I went about getting it wrong the first 3 times. And then I saw you up there, and I thought—" He stopped again. "What?" she said. "I thought you looked angry enough to stay." She stared at him. "That was your method?" she said. "You're looking for someone angry enough?" "The other ones came in wanting to be liked," he said. "You came in wanting to be treated like a person. That's different." She thought about that for a moment. "I am angry," she said. "I know. I haven't decided yet whether I'm angry at you." "That's fair," he said. "I haven't decided yet whether I deserve it." He pushed off the post and went inside. She sat there a while longer, watching the stars come out one by one, feeling the strange and unsettling sensation of having been understood by someone she hadn't expected to understand her. The frontier dark settled in around the ranch. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted and blew. Inside the house, she could hear the low murmur of Eli talking. To Abigail, probably, or to himself, which was his default. She was still angry. She was also, she realized, paying attention in a way she hadn't been before. To the layout of the land, to the quality of the silence, to the way the house looked, lit from within. against the enormous dark. It wasn't home, but it was solid. And solid right now was something. The second week was harder than the first. She had expected that. The first week had been shock and assessment, theirs of her, hers of them. And shock has a kind of numbness to it that makes things bearable. The second week was when everyone involved understood that this was actually happening, that she was not a temporary disruption but something more permanent. And the reaction to that understanding was not warm. Eli had moved past the open gates and the misplaced tools into something more deliberate. He started telling the ranch hands things, small things, worded carefully, that made them look at her sideways. She didn't find out about it directly. She found out because one of the hands, a young man named Cord, who seemed constitutionally incapable of keeping information to himself, mentioned offhandedly that the boy said you threw out his mother's preserves on purpose. She had not touched anyone's preserves. She hadn't been in the cellar. She found Eli in the yard after she'd heard this, splitting wood with more energy than the task required for a 12-year-old. "I need to talk to you," she said. He kept splitting. "I'm busy." "You can be busy in a minute." She waited. He put the axe down with the controlled aggression of someone who wanted to throw it. "What?" "I didn't touch your mother's preserves." He looked at her with those dark, careful eyes. He didn't say anything. "I understand why you'd want to make things harder for me," she said. "I'm not angry about it. But I need you to stop lying to the hands because if they don't trust me, I can't do my job. And if I can't do my job, your father can't do his. So it's about him. It's about all of us." She kept her voice level. "What is it you actually want, Eli? Because running me off isn't going to bring her back." It landed wrong. She knew it the second it was out of her mouth. Too direct. Too soon. His face closed like a shutter. "You don't know anything about that," he said, picked up the axe, and went back to splitting with a fury that ended the conversation. She walked back to the house feeling the particular frustration of having been right about the wrong thing at the wrong time. Some lessons on the homestead had been like that. You could know exactly what a plant needed and still kill it by applying that knowledge in the wrong season. She would try again, but differently. Abigail's resistance that second week was harder to locate because Abigail was smart enough to make it look like cooperation. She completed every task. She was present at meals. She said yes, ma'am, at the appropriate moments with an intonation that managed to be both technically correct and faintly mocking, but she had started doing something new. She would finish her chores and then disappear for hours at a time. Not to the barn, not to the yard, not to any of the places Evelyn had begun to map as the children's territory. She was just gone. And when she came back, she was closed in a particular way, the way of someone who has been somewhere they intend to keep private. Evelyn asked Clara about it. Clara was rolling biscuit dough at the kitchen table, and she did not look up. "She goes to the creek," she said. "The one about half a mile east past the cottonwoods. She's been going there since her mother died." "Does Wyatt know?" "He knows." Clara paused the rolling. "He used to go with her first few months, then she started going alone." She pressed the dough flat. "She doesn't want company there. I'd leave it alone if I were you." Evelyn left it alone, for now. It was the bread that changed something, and she hadn't planned it. She'd been raised by a father who believed a kitchen was something you survived rather than spent time in, which meant she had largely taught herself to cook out of necessity, trial, and error. She was competent, but not inspired. The one thing she had figured out over years of trying was bread. The specific alchemy of yeast and flour and patience. The way the dough changed under your hands from a shaggy mess into something alive and warm and elastic. She found it meditative in a way she couldn't quite explain, the physical rhythm of it. On Saturdays, she made bread because they were low and it needed to be done. She did not think about the children while she did it. She was simply in the kitchen at 6 a.m. with the fire going and flour on her hands. Abigail came down the stairs at 6:30 for reasons that were probably unrelated to the bread and stopped in the kitchen doorway. "What are you doing?" "Bread." Abigail looked at the dough on the board. "The last one bought bread from Dry Creek. I know how to make it." She expected Abigail to leave. Abigail stayed in the doorway. Then, with the elaborate casualness of someone trying not to look interested, she moved to the other side of the table. "Mother made bread," she said. "My mother did too," Evelyn said. "She died when I was 9. I had to learn from watching her and then trying to remember what I'd watched. She said this plainly, without calculation, and she meant it plainly. She wasn't trying to engineer a connection. She was just answering. Abigail watched her hands on the dough. She taught me, she said. Some of it. What did she teach you? The folding. She said it like it was a technical term. She said most people just need it straight, but the folding is what makes the inside right. Evelyn looked at the dough. Can you show me? It was not a performance of humility. She genuinely didn't know what Abigail's mother had meant, and she genuinely wanted to. Abigail seemed to understand this because she came around the table without being asked a second time, and she put her hands on the dough, and she showed her. The method was subtle, a kind of stretching and folding inward rather than pushing through, and when Abigail did it, she had the confident muscle memory ease of someone repeating something they'd been taught young. Her hands were her mother's hands doing her mother's thing in her mother's kitchen, and for a moment something crossed Abigail's face that was too complicated to be just sadness. Like that, Abigail said, stepping back. Like that, Evelyn said, and tried it. She did it wrong the first time, and Abigail corrected her, and then she did it better, and Abigail said nothing, which was as close to approval as she'd gotten so far. The bread came out good, better than her usual, actually. She suspected it was the folding. Abigail ate 2 pieces at breakfast without acknowledging them, which felt, in the peculiar grammar of 12-year-old pride, like a compliment. Eli came to her. She hadn't expected that. She had been thinking about how to approach him again, more carefully this time, giving the wound she'd poked a week to close over. She had plans. She had revised those plans twice. And then he appeared in the doorway of the room she was using as a sitting space one evening, with his notebook under his arm and an expression of aggressive nonchalance. I have more observations, he said, about the migration patterns. You said you wanted to see them. She put down the mending she'd been doing. I did say that. He came in and sat in the other chair, the small wooden one, and he opened the notebook. The pages she could see from across the small table were covered in the same dense, dated notation she'd seen in the loft. But there were also drawings, quick, accurate sketches of birds she recognized and some she didn't, each labeled in his cramped printing. These are very good, she said, meaning the drawings. They're just reference, he said, and then, do you actually know anything about birds? Not much. I know the ones that were on our property. Which ones? She listed them. He listened and then corrected her on 2 of the identifications, explaining why, with the patient superiority of an expert who is also 12 and therefore cannot quite conceal his pleasure at knowing more than an adult. You might be right, she said. I probably assumed rather than looked. Most people do, he said. It's because they think they've seen something before, so they stop seeing it. She looked at him. That's a good observation. He shifted in the chair. It's just obvious. Obvious things are easy to miss. He looked at her with that same careful assessment. He was still deciding about her. She could feel it. Still running whatever internal measurement he'd been running since the wagon pulled in and trying to figure out which column she belonged in. She knew better than to push. Tell me about the migration, she said. Start from the beginning. He started from the beginning. He went for an hour and a half, and she asked questions, and he corrected her on most of them, and she let herself be corrected and asked more questions. And by the time Clara called them for supper, something had shifted in the temperature of the room. Not warmth exactly, but less cold. On the way to the kitchen, he said without looking at her, I didn't actually touch the preserves, but I shouldn't have said you did. No, she said. You shouldn't have. I won't do it again. All right. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say she forgave him. She just said all right because she'd figured out that he responded better to things being settled than to things being made into moments. He was like that. Some people are. The ranch hands were a different problem. There were 4 of them full-time. Cord, who was young and talky. Pete, who was old and said nothing that didn't need saying. A man named Dex, who had some ongoing relationship with hard liquor that was mostly managed but occasionally wasn't. And a 4th named Samuel, who kept to himself and did his work with the competence of someone who'd been doing it for decades and had long since stopped needing to be told. They were polite to her in the surface way of men who have been told to be polite and have decided to comply without commitment. She was the housekeeper. That was the category. The category came with its own set of assumptions, some of them complimentary and most of them limiting. She decided not to fight the category directly. She just worked around it. The first time she went to the barn to check on one of the mares who'd been favoring a leg, Cord appeared at her shoulder with the protective anxiety of someone who thinks you're about to make a mistake. "I can take a look at her, ma'am," he said. "I've got it," she said. She ran her hand down the mare's foreleg with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who'd done it before, found the slight heat above the fetlock, applied pressure until she found the spot that made the horse flinch. She straightened up. "It's not the hoof," she said. "It's higher up. She needs the leg wrapped, and she needs to stay off the north pasture for at least a week." Cord looked at her. "My father ran cattle," she said. "We had horses. I wasn't raised in a parlor," he told Pete. Pete came and looked for himself, made the same assessment, and then looked at her with slightly more interest than before. "Where was your father's place?" Pete asked. She told him. He knew the county. They talked about it for a few minutes in the plain, practical way of people comparing ground they both understood. And when she walked back to the house, she could feel the change. Marginal, not dramatic, but real. She had moved from category to person in Pete's accounting, and Pete was old enough that the others paid attention to him. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't smooth. Dex still looked through her on his difficult days. Cord was friendly, but had the habit of talking to Wyatt about things he should have talked to her about first, and she had to correct that twice before it started to hold. But it was movement. Forward, if slow. Punch. Wyatt noticed. She wasn't sure when she'd started being aware of when he was watching, but she had. He was not obvious about it. He was not a man who was obvious about things, but there were moments when she'd look up from whatever she was doing and catch his attention sliding somewhere neutral, the deliberate nothing of someone redirecting. He watched the way the children changed around her. He watched her in the barn with the hands. He watched her at the table when she managed to draw Eli into a conversation about something other than silence. He didn't comment on any of it. But one evening, about 3 weeks in, when the children were in bed and Clara had gone home, and the ranch had gone quiet in the particular way of frontier nights, he came in from outside and found her at the kitchen table with the accounts book she'd been trying to make sense of. "That's mine," he said. "I know. I'm trying to figure out how you're accounting for the spring feed costs because the way it's organized right now makes it very difficult to see what anything actually cost." He sat down across from her. He looked at the page she had open. "My wife used to manage the accounts," he said. "I can see her system," Evelyn said. "It was good. It just wasn't finished when she stopped." He was quiet. "No," he said. "It wasn't." She didn't push into that. She turned the book so he could see the columns she'd been working through. "If I reorganize the feed costs by month rather than by vendor, you'll be able to see the actual seasonal pattern and plan better." He looked at the columns. "You know bookkeeping?" "My father was terrible at it," she said, "which meant I had to learn to do it for him, and then I had to watch what happens when it isn't done right. I'd rather not repeat that." He studied the page for a moment, then, "Go ahead." She went ahead. He stayed at the table for a while, not doing anything, just being there in the way of someone who isn't ready to leave a place yet. She didn't comment on it. She worked. He sat. After a while he said, "Abigail told me you let her show you the bread method. She knows something I don't. That seemed worth acknowledging." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The others, they tried to take over everything, every single thing, like they could replace what was missing by doing more of it." She looked up from the columns. "That's not how people work." "No," he said. "It isn't." She held his gaze for a moment and then went back to the accounts. He sat a little longer. Then he went to bed, and she finished the column she was on. And when she finally put out the lamp and went to her room, the house was dark and settled around her in a way that felt very slightly like it was getting used to her weight. The fourth week brought the first thing that felt, against all her caution, like progress. Abigail came to her at the start of it with a face that was doing a great deal of work to look neutral and said, "I want to show you something, if you want." Evelyn put down what she was doing. "All right." They walked half a mile east through dry grass and then through cottonwoods that announced the creek before you could see it, and then the creek was there. A genuine one. Not the seasonal trickle she'd expected, but a running stretch of clear water that moved over flat stones and made a sound she hadn't realized she'd been missing until she heard it. There were willows at the edges, a large flat rock that jutted out over the water, worn smooth. Abigail sat on the rock. Evelyn sat beside her, leaving space. "Mother liked it here," Abigail said. "I can see why." She said it was the only place on the ranch where it didn't feel like there was work waiting. Evelyn looked at the water. That's a specific thing to notice. She noticed specific things. Abigail picked up a small stone and turned it over. She wasn't perfect. She got impatient sometimes. She was impatient with Eli's talking. She'd get a look on her face when he'd been explaining something for too long. A small pause. I miss that look. Isn't that strange? I miss the impatient look. No, Evelyn said. That makes complete sense. Abigail threw the stone. It skipped twice. I don't want to forget her. You won't. How do you know? Because you still fold the bread her way, Evelyn said. Because you have her look. Because the things people teach us stay in our hands and our faces even when we're not thinking about them. Abigail was quiet for a long time. The water moved. A bird Evelyn couldn't name landed on the far bank and then left. You're not trying to be her, Abigail said finally. It wasn't quite a question. No, Evelyn said. I'm not. I wouldn't be able to even if I tried. Good, Abigail said. Another long pause. You can come here if you want, sometimes. She said it looking at the water, not at Evelyn, with the careful offhandedness of a 12-year-old offering something important while trying to make it look like nothing much. Evelyn understood the gift exactly. Thank you, she said. She matched Abigail's tone exactly, measured, unremarkable, and she watched the girl's shoulders settle just slightly. They sat by the creek for another half hour, and they didn't talk much, and the silence between them was the first comfortable silence they had shared, and it was worth more than most of the words that had been said up to that point. The house was different at 5 weeks than it had been at 1. Not transformed, she was too clear-eyed about what transformation actually required to call it that yet, but different. Meals were no longer timed exercises in endurance. Eli had started appearing in the kitchen in the mornings to read his books at the table while she worked, which he would have loudly denied was a social choice, but which was one. Abigail occasionally sang while she did chores, not loudly, not performatively, just the absent kind of singing that happens when you've forgotten to guard yourself. Wyatt watched all of this from his usual positions, porch, doorway, across the table, with the face of a man trying to understand something he'd decided ahead of time was probably impossible. One evening, she found him outside the barn, standing still, looking at the house with the kitchen light on inside. You can see them through the window, he said when she stopped beside him. Eli was visible at the kitchen table, head bent over something. Abigail's shadow moved past. Yes, she said. Last year, he said, I stood here and the house was dark at this hour because nobody wanted to be in it. She didn't say anything. I'm not telling you this because you need to know it, he said. I'm telling you because I don't know who else to tell. She considered that for a moment. The statement was honest in a way that cost him something. She could hear it. Wyatt Mercer was a man who had learned to manage things by himself for so long that honesty with another person had become an action that required effort. You can tell me things, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her. You keep saying that, he said. Because it keeps being true, she said. He looked back at the house. The light in the kitchen moved as Eli got up for something and came back. I almost didn't go to that auction, he said. I almost talked myself out of it. What changed your mind? Pete, he said. He told me to stop being too proud to ask for help. A slight pause. He also told me he'd say I never listened to him when I was gone, so I was going to do it. She laughed. It came out fully, without planning, and she heard the unfamiliar sound of it in the evening air. It had been a long time since she'd laughed at something. Wyatt looked at her when she laughed, with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Surprised, she thought, and something else that moved through his face quickly, and was gone before she could name it. Pete is a good man, she said. The best I know, he said. Don't tell him I said that. She was still smiling when she went back inside. She could feel it, the way you can feel sunlight on your skin even after you've stepped into shade. She did not think too much about what that meant. She was a practical person. She understood the difference between a moment and a pattern, and she had learned the hard way that reading too much into moments was a good way to end up wrong and hurt. But she also understood that she was paying attention to this man in a way she hadn't been paying attention to anything in a long time, and that there was a difference between noting that and acting on it, and right now noting it was enough. The house received her when she came in. The children were where they were supposed to be. The kitchen smelled of the stew she'd left on low, and the accounts book was on the table where she'd left it, and the accounts were making more sense every day. She was still angry. She thought she might always be a little angry, that it was part of her in a way she'd eventually stop fighting. But the anger had a different shape now than it had on the auction platform. Then it had been the formless, spiked thing of someone with nothing to hold on to. Now it was sharpening into something she recognized. Not rage, but refusal. Refusal to be reduced. Refusal to be invisible. She set the stew to cool and went to check on the accounts, and the ranch settled around her the way it was learning to do, and she let it. The cold came early that year. Pete said so one morning in late October, standing in the yard and reading the sky the way old men on the frontier read skies. Not with instruments, but with the accumulated weight of decades of being wrong and being right about weather, until the difference between the two started to feel like something in your bones. Too early, he said. Wrong kind of cold. The damp kind. Evelyn had been bringing in the last of the kitchen garden, which she'd put in on a trial basis in August, and which had produced modestly and imperfectly just enough to make her think next year would be better. She straightened up with an armful of the last carrots and looked at the sky he was reading. It was a flat, gray-white sky, the kind that looked less like clouds and more like the world had simply run out of blue. The air had that particular quality of holding something, not yet releasing it, but holding it with intent. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," Pete said, which from Pete was the same as saying very bad indeed. She brought the carrots in and spent the rest of the day doing what you do before a hard freeze, covering what could be covered, moving what could be moved, making sure the barn doors seated properly in their frames, and that there was enough wood split and stacked to be convincing. The hands worked alongside her without being asked, because the hands could also feel what Pete felt in the sky, and because the ranch had developed somewhere in the past 2 months a kind of functional trust between them and her that meant they moved in the same direction without requiring negotiation. Eli helped with the wood. Abigail helped with the garden, picking the last of the things that could be saved with the focused efficiency she brought to practical tasks. They worked without talking much, which had become their particular version of comfortable. Not silence because there was nothing to say, but silence because the work was there and the work was enough. Wyatt came back from the north pasture at dusk with cord and decks, all of them moving with the energy of men who'd pushed hard to finish something before the weather changed. He caught Evelyn's eye across the yard with a look that said, "You already started then." She shrugged, meaning, "Pete told me." He nodded, meaning, "Right." They were getting good at that, the shorthand of people who had been in the same space long enough to have their own frequency. It started with Abigail. Not the cold. That came as Pete had promised, a hard freeze that night that left the ground iron and the water in the outside trough skinned with ice by morning. That was manageable. The cold was just weather. What started with Abigail was something else. She was quiet at breakfast 3 days after the freeze, which wasn't unusual, but the quality of the quiet was different. Not the chosen quiet of a girl guarding herself, but the effortful quiet of someone working to seem normal. Evelyn noticed it the way she'd learned to notice Abigail's signals. Not loudly, not obviously, but as a change in air pressure. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked. "Fine," Abigail said, and ate her breakfast, and went to do her chores. By afternoon, she was not fine. Evelyn found her in the barn sitting on a hay bale with her elbows on her knees and her face the wrong color, too pale in the cheeks but with 2 bright spots high on her cheekbones that were not the color of cold but the color of heat. She put her hand on Abigail's forehead. It was very warm. "Come inside," she said. "I'm not done with the horses will survive without you today. Come inside." She got her into bed and sent cord for the doctor in Dry Creek, which was 12 miles and not a quick errand. Then she went to Eli's room to check on him, because they were twins and had been together all day, and she thought of the flu she'd seen move through the homestead when she was 10 and the speed with which it had gone from 1 person to 3. Eli was at his desk with his notebook and said he felt fine, and she looked at his eyes and his color and touched his forehead and thought, for now. For now turned out to be about 6 hours. By evening, Eli had the fever too, and it was higher than Abigail's. Awesome. The doctor arrived the following morning. He was a small man named Calloway, who had the manner of someone perpetually annoyed at the conditions he was asked to work in, which on the frontier were never the conditions he would have chosen. He examined both children with quick, competent hands, and then came to the kitchen where Wyatt was standing with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing. Influenza, Calloway said. Both of them. The boy's worse. Wyatt said, what do we do? Keep them warm. Keep fluids in them. Bring the fever down when it climbs too high. Cold compresses, not ice. If the cough develops into the chest, send for me immediately. He paused. Do you have anyone to sit with them? Wyatt looked at Evelyn. Yes, she said. Calloway looked at her with the measuring look of a man assessing competence. You've done this before? My father, she said. I was 14. It went on for 3 weeks. He seemed to decide she was adequate. Then you know what you're doing. Don't let the fever run unchecked. Don't let them sleep too long without waking them to drink. And don't, he stopped, seemed to choose his words. Don't assume a break in the fever is the end of it. The second rise is usually worse. He left her with instructions and a small supply of medication and the bill, which Wyatt paid without looking at it. When the sound of the doctor's horse had faded down the road, the house went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Wyatt was still standing in the kitchen. He had not moved from the spot he'd been in since Calloway arrived. He was looking at the doorway to the hall, beyond which his children were sick in their rooms, and his face had a quality she had not seen on it before, a kind of controlled unraveling, like a rope holding under too much tension. Wyatt, she said. He turned. His eyes were somewhere else. Go sit with them, she said. I'll make broth. You go sit with them. He went. She made broth. The first 2 nights were bad but manageable. The fevers climbed and she brought them down. The children drank what she made them drink. Abigail slept in long, restless stretches that left her wrung out and pale. Eli slept less and burned hotter, and had the irritable, unfocused misery of a sick 12-year-old boy who resented being sick with a passion bordering on personal offense. This is useless, he said, on the second morning, meaning being ill in bed. Yes, she agreed. It's terrible. Drink this. What is it? Broth with some things in it. What things? Things that will help. Drink it. He drank it, grimacing, and then lay back and stared at the ceiling with the expression of someone reviewing the injustices of his situation. How's Abby? He asked. About the same as you. Is she more sick or less sick? About the same. She's always less sick than me, he said. When we were 7 and got the stomach thing, she was fine in 2 days, and I went on for a week. That's very unfair, Evelyn said. It is, he agreed, with feeling. She wrung out the cloth in the cool water and pressed it to his forehead, and he didn't flinch the way he once would have. He'd stopped pulling back from her hand some weeks ago, in the incremental way of someone who doesn't want to admit they've become accustomed to comfort. Wyatt came and went. He sat with them in the mornings while she slept a few hours, and she sat with them through the afternoons and nights while he ran what needed to be run. You could not let a ranch sit, even in a crisis, because the animals didn't care about your crisis and the work accumulated. He came in each evening looking like a man who had worked through his own exhaustion to somewhere past it, and she would meet him in the hall outside the children's rooms and give him the report. Temperature this morning, appetite, what they'd kept down. He listened to everything she said with the absolute attention of a man for whom this information was the most important thing in the world, and then he would say, "All right," and go in. On the third night, she heard him through the wall. Not words. She wasn't close enough for words, but the sound of his voice, low and continuous, which meant he was talking to them. It went on for a long time. She didn't know what he was saying, and she didn't need to. The doctor had been right about the second rise. On the 4th day, Abigail seemed to improve. Her fever dropped to something manageable. Her color came back. She ate a small bowl of the broth and kept it down, and then slept for 6 hours without Evelyn having to wake her. It looked, with an optimism Evelyn consciously tried to resist, like turning a corner. On the 5th day, Abigail's fever climbed to 104 degrees. Evelyn stood over her with the thermometer and felt her stomach drop in a specific, targeted way. She pressed her lips together and sent for Calloway again, and then stripped the extra blankets from Abigail's bed and brought fresh, cool water and started working. Calloway arrived that evening, and his face, when he checked her, was more serious than before. He didn't perform calmness the way some doctors did. He said, "This is the crisis point. The next 24 hours." Wyatt was in the doorway. She heard what Calloway's phrasing cost him, the slight intake that he stopped before it became sound. "What do I do?" she asked Calloway. "What you've been doing. The difference between it going one way or the other is frequently just that, sustained care, not letting up." He left again. She moved a chair into Abigail's room and she did not leave. Wyatt appeared in the doorway an hour later. His face was a landscape of something that didn't have one name: fear, guilt, grief, some amalgam of all three that made him look older than he was. "I'll take a shift," he said. "I've got it," she said. "Evelyn?" His voice was uneven. "I need to do something." She looked at him. "Then sit here," she said, and moved her chair slightly. "But I'm not leaving." He brought another chair. They sat on opposite sides of Abigail's bed, and Evelyn kept the compresses going and kept watch on the breathing and kept checking the temperature at regular intervals, and Wyatt sat with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, not sleeping. At some point, past midnight, she thought, though she'd stopped tracking time precisely, he said, "Her mother, at the end. I sat in a chair like this." She didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on Abigail's face. "I know," she said finally. "I couldn't—" He stopped. "There was nothing I could do. That's the thing. You sit there and you do everything you can think of, and in the end, there's nothing. You just watch." "I know," she said again. "I can't watch that again." His voice had stripped down to something raw and honest that she suspected he had not allowed in a very long time. "I can't sit here and watch." "Then don't watch," she said. "Listen." She moved the compress, checked the temperature. "Tell me what she was like, your wife. Tell me something about her." He lifted his head. "What?" "Tell me something," she said. "Talk. It keeps you from just sitting in your own head." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't, then, "She sang badly," he said. She knew it, didn't stop her. A pause. "She sang to the children when they were small, completely off. They loved it." "Abigail sings," Evelyn said. "When she doesn't think anyone's listening." Something moved across his face. "She does?" "In the mornings. Not real songs, just sounds." He was quiet again, looking at his daughter. "She has her mother's hands," he said. "I notice it when she does chores, the way she holds things." "She folds bread like her," Evelyn said. "She showed me." "Did she?" It wasn't a question. She was very precise about it. He almost smiled. It wasn't all the way, but it was more than she'd seen in days. They kept talking, low and quiet, trading small things, memories of his, observations of hers, the kind of conversation that isn't really about the words, but about the presence, about making sound in a dark room, because the alternative is just the dark. She talked about her father, some of it, the parts that didn't require explanation. He talked about the ranch before the children were born, what it had looked like when he first got it, all the things that had needed doing that seemed impossible at the time. They talked about Eli's birds, a little. They talked about Pete and his weather predictions, which had an accuracy rate that defied explanation. Around 3 a.m, Abigail shifted and made a sound, and both of them went still. Evelyn leaned forward and put her hand on the girl's forehead. Cooler. Not gone, not yet, but measurably cooler. She reached for the thermometer. She pressed her lips together while she waited. Then she looked at the reading. 101. Dropping. She released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Wyatt was watching her face. He read it before she spoke. He put his elbows back on his knees and pressed his hands over his face and made a sound that was not a word. It lasted only a moment. Then he sat back up and looked at his daughter with red eyes and the expression of a man who has been handed something back that he had already resigned himself to losing. "She still needs to be watched," Evelyn said quietly. "Through the rest of the night. The temperature could move again." "I know," he said. I'm not leaving. I know, he said again. Pasos. She did not in the end leave for 3 days. She slept in the chair in pieces, 40 minutes here, an hour there, and managed the children in the intervals and ate what Clara brought her without tasting any of it. She was running on the specific fuel of necessity, which is not a pleasant fuel, but is a reliable one. Eli's fever peaked on the 6th day, less dramatically than Abigail's, but with a sustained endurance that was its own kind of alarming. Not the crisis spike, but the long, grinding grind of a temperature that would not come all the way down, hovering in the range of 102, climbing to 103 at night, and then retreating, but not enough. Not quite enough. She moved between rooms. She managed the compresses and the broth and the medication and the waking at intervals, and she talked to both of them when they were awake enough to talk, which was not always, and sat with them when they weren't. On the 6th night, Eli was awake at 2 in the morning, too uncomfortable to sleep, and she was in the chair beside his bed and he was staring at the ceiling. "Tell me something," he said. She recognized the phrase. She had used it with his father. "What do you want to know?" "Anything." A pause. "Something about you. You always ask things about us?" She thought for a moment. "I had a dog when I was small," she said. "She was enormous, part shepherd, part something nobody could identify. My father called her Disaster because she knocked things over." "What did you call her?" "Rosie." "That's a terrible name for an enormous dog." She didn't seem to mind it. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss your father?" "Yes," she said. "Not the way I did at first. It gets different. You don't stop. It just changes shape." He was quiet again. "I miss my mother differently than Abby does," he said. "Abby misses her all at once. I miss her in pieces. Like when I find something new and I want to tell her, or when something's funny. Those are when it's bad." "That makes sense," she said. "Does it get less?" She thought about telling him it gets easier, which was what adults usually said, and which was the kind of smoothed-out answer that children can tell is only half true. "It gets less sharp," she said, "and then something happens, and it's sharp again for a little while. But the in-between times get longer." He thought about that. "Okay," he said. Just okay. Like it was something he could work with. His temperature dropped the following morning. Not all the way, but enough that she could feel the shift when she touched his forehead, the fever losing confidence, retreating. By afternoon, it was below 100. By evening, both children were sleeping real sleep. Not the restless sick sleep, but the heavy, restorative kind. She sat in the hall between their rooms because she wasn't ready to not be within earshot of both of them, and she leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She heard Wyatt's boots on the stairs. She did not open her eyes. He sat down next to her, his back against the wall, and for a while neither of them said anything. "Both of them," she said finally, without opening her eyes. "I know," he said. "I checked. The fever will probably come back a little tonight. It usually makes one more run, but it won't be what it was." "All right." She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling of the hall. It needed paint, she noticed. There was a hairline crack running from the light fixture toward the far wall. She filed this away with the information about the 4th fence post on the east side that needed replacing and the hinges on the cellar door that squeaked. "You should sleep," Wyatt said. "So should you. You haven't slept properly in 3 days. Neither have you." A pause. "Evelyn." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for the past weeks. Not Miss Hart anymore. Not since sometime in the 2nd month. Just her name, said simply and without ceremony. "What you did?" "I did what needed doing." "Don't do that," he said. "Don't make it small." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the same stripped-down directness she'd heard in his voice at 3 in the morning over Abigail's bed, the look of someone too exhausted for pretense. "I was scared," she said. "If you want the truth, I was scared every hour of it." "You didn't act scared." "You act the opposite of what you feel," she said. "That's what fear makes you do, if you've got any sense." He held her gaze. "My wife," he said, and stopped. "You don't have to say it," she said. "I know. I want to." He looked at the wall across from them. "When she was dying, I kept thinking, if I just did enough, if I was present enough, if I stayed awake long enough, like attention could be a cure." His jaw worked. It wasn't, obviously. And when it was over, I told myself I was never going to let myself believe that again. That presence mattered, that it changed anything. He stopped. She waited. "You've been here 3 days," he said. "Not sleeping, doing the same thing I told myself was useless, and the fever's broke." "Wyatt," she said carefully. "The fever's breaking isn't—" "I know," he said. "I know that. The disease ran its course. Calloway would say the same thing." He paused. "But they knew you were there. I could tell. Even when they were at their worst, they knew." He looked at his hands. "That's what I mean. Not that you cured them, that they knew they weren't alone." She didn't know what to say to that. She was too tired for eloquence and too honest for deflection, so she sat with it. "My father knew I was there," she said finally. "At the end. I sat with him the same way. He died anyway." She felt the familiar ache of it. "But I still think it was the right thing, to stay." "Yes," Wyatt said. "That's what I mean." They sat in the hall a little longer. Down the corridor, the house was quiet. A board settled somewhere in the cold. The fire in the downstairs hearth was probably burning low, and someone would need to tend it, and there was tomorrow's broth to think about, and the temperature checks in the night. But right now, none of that was urgent. Right now, the children were breathing in their rooms, and the fever had broken, and there was a man sitting next to her in a hallway who was also breathing, also here. And that was enough to hold on to for a minute. She was so tired her eyes burned. "Go to sleep," Wyatt said. His voice was quiet. "In a minute," she said, and meant it. She fell asleep sitting against the wall 7 minutes later. She didn't know this because she fell asleep, but when she woke up, a few hours later, gray dawn showing at the end of the hall, there was a folded blanket across her shoulders that had not been there before. She sat with that for a moment. Then she got up, checked the children, both sleeping, both cooler, both unmistakably on the right side of it, and went downstairs to start the fire and the broth, because the morning needed doing and the ranch didn't stop. And somewhere between the fear and the exhaustion and the night in the hall, she had understood, without deciding it, that this was where she was supposed to be. The children recovered the way children do, faster than seemed reasonable, with a resilience that made the adults around them feel simultaneously relieved and vaguely outpaced. By the 3rd day after the fever broke, Eli was asking when he could go back to the barn. By the 4th, Abigail was complaining that the broth was too thin and could she please have something that required chewing. Evelyn made them stay in bed through the 5th day on principle, partly because Calloway had said a full week, and partly because she wanted to be certain. And by the 6th day, she let them come downstairs for meals. And by the 7th, they were simply themselves again. A little thinner, a little quieter than usual in the residue of the illness, but fundamentally, stubbornly, entirely themselves. She watched Abigail eat a full breakfast on that 7th morning. Proper eggs, toast, everything. And felt something release in her chest that she hadn't quite realized had been clenched there since the moment she'd put her hand on a feverish forehead and felt the heat. "You're staring," Abigail said without looking up from her plate. "I'm making sure you actually eat it. I'm eating it. You're eating it slowly. It tastes better when you're not in a hurry." She looked up. "Clara told me you didn't sleep for 3 days. Clara exaggerates. Clara doesn't exaggerate. She's the most literal person on this ranch." Abigail put her fork down just for a moment. "You stayed." Evelyn met her eyes. "Yes." Abigail picked up her fork again. "Okay," she said, in the way she'd started saying things that mattered. Flat, understated, with everything underneath it visible if you knew how to look. Eli, for his part, said nothing directly on the subject. He came downstairs that first morning looking embarrassed in the specific way of someone who had been sick in front of a person they were still deciding about, and his embarrassment told her everything she needed to know about how he felt. He sat at his place, ate his breakfast, and then said without preamble, "The crows were at the east fence this morning. Unusual for November." "Were they?" she said. "I want to go out and observe when I'm allowed." "Saturday," she said, "if your temperature stays down." "It's down." "Saturday," she repeated. He looked like he wanted to argue and decided not to. "Fine," he said, which from Eli was a form of gratitude. The house in the weeks after the illness had a different quality than it had before. She noticed it but found it difficult to name. Not warmer exactly. The stoves were the same, the drafts were the same. But something had changed in the way the rooms related to each other, the way people moved through them. The children sought her out now, without the careful indirection they'd used before. Eli appeared at her elbow with his notebook when he had something to show her. Abigail started coming to the kitchen in the evenings, not always to help, sometimes just to be there, to sit at the table and draw or read while Evelyn worked through whatever needed doing before bed. Clara noticed. She had a way of observing without commenting, but one afternoon in the kitchen she said, without particular inflection, "They've stopped testing you." "They've mostly stopped," Evelyn said. "That's not a small thing," Clara said. "I've been watching those two children since they were born, and they tested their father for 2 years after their mother died and never did stop. Not really." She rolled her pastry without elaborating further, which was Clara's version of saying, "Think about what I just told you." Evelyn thought about it. Wyatt was the one she couldn't read. That was the thing she turned over in the long, quiet stretches of the work. The accounts she was still improving, the bread making in the early mornings, the fence inspection she'd started doing on foot because she'd found it useful to know the property herself rather than through other people's reports. She turned it over the way you worry at a knot, not pulling hard because you know hard pulling makes it tighter, just working it, trying to understand the shape of it. He had sat with her in the hallway. He had covered her with a blanket. He had said things in the dark that she suspected he had not said to another person in 2 years. And then the morning had come, and he had been courteous, clear-eyed, and almost entirely himself again, as if the night had been a room they'd stepped into briefly and then both stepped back out of. She respected that. She understood self-protection. She had her own substantial collection of it. But there were moments. At the table when he said something dry, and she laughed, and his eyes stayed on her face a half-second longer than required. At the barn, when she was explaining something to Cord about the mares, and she turned and found Wyatt in the doorway behind her, just arrived, with the expression of someone who has been watching longer than the conversation could explain. Small things, marginal things, things you could talk yourself out of if you needed to. She mostly talked herself out of them. What she could not talk herself out of was the fact that somewhere in the past 3 months the ranch had become the first place since her father's homestead that felt like hers. Not in ownership, she understood exactly what she was and wasn't here, but in the way you know a place in your hands and feet, the way you know where the third step on the stairs makes a different sound, and which window sticks in the cold, and how many minutes it takes to walk from the house to the north fence at a working pace versus a walking pace. She knew this land now. She knew the rhythms of it. And some mornings, standing in the kitchen with the fire just going and the house still quiet, and the sky outside doing its frontier thing with color, she felt something close to at home, and then immediately felt suspicious of that feeling, and then felt it anyway. The conversation she hadn't been expecting came on a Tuesday, late in November. She had been in the main room working through an inventory list, what supplies they'd need to order before the full winter set in, what they were short on, what could wait. When she heard Wyatt's boots in the hall, and he appeared in the doorway, which was usual, and then came fully into the room and sat down in the chair across from her, and didn't say anything right away, which was less usual. She looked up. He had the look of someone who had been working up to something. She had learned to recognize this look on him. The carefully neutral face that was trying to cover the fact that he was thinking hard about how to begin. She put the inventory list down. He was quiet for another moment, then, "I want to talk to you about what you're owed." She looked at him steadily. "All right, I've been doing this wrong," he said, "since the beginning. I brought you here, and I set you to work, and I didn't make clear what this arrangement actually was, what your standing was." "My standing," she repeated. "You're not a servant," he said. "I need you to know that. I know that's what the paperwork says, and that's what the town would say, and I should have said something about it before now, but what you've done here is not what I hired. It's not what I paid for." He shook his head, frustrated with his own phrasing. "That's not what I mean. What I mean is, Wyatt." She said his name the way he'd been saying hers for months now, without formality, without distance. "I know I'm not a servant. Do you?" "I've always known what I am," she said. The question is whether you know. He looked at her. I know you're the reason my daughter showed me her mother's bread method. I know you're the reason my son talks instead of disappearing into his own head. I know you're the reason I can run this ranch without feeling like I'm also watching it come apart from the inside. He stopped. That's not a debt. That's not something I hired. And I don't want you to be here because you feel like you have to be. She was quiet for a moment. Are you asking me to leave? She said. Or are you asking me to stay for a different reason? He held her gaze. I'm asking you what you want, he said, which I should have asked a long time ago. This was the thing she had not quite prepared for, despite having turned the knot over in her hands for weeks. The direct question. Her own want, placed in the room without qualifier. She had spent 18 years of her life having her wants be the last thing that mattered in any accounting. Her father's needs, the homestead's needs, the bank's needs, the county's needs, all of it ahead of anything she might have preferred. She had learned to operate so efficiently inside constraints that she had almost forgotten what she would choose if there were no constraints at all. I want to tell you something first, she said. He waited. I came here angry, she said. You know that? I was angry at what had happened to me, and I was half angry at you, because you were part of it, even if you were the least bad part. I was going to do the job and leave when something better appeared, and I told myself that for the first month. I know, he said. I could tell. What happened instead, she said, was that I started to give a damn. About the children. About the land. About the work. She paused. About you. She said it plainly, because plainly was the only way she knew to say true things. And I am not interested in giving a damn about something and then walking away from it because the circumstances that brought me here weren't ones I would have chosen. His eyes didn't move off her face. Evelyn, he said, I'm not finished. He waited. I also need you to understand that I am not a replacement. I'm not going to be what she was, and I wouldn't try to be, and the children know that, and I think you know it too. What I am is what I am, which is stubborn and uncertain and still angry about some things on a regular basis, and I make mistakes and I don't always explain myself well, and sometimes I'll be wrong. She looked at him. I'm telling you this because I've watched people come into situations wanting to be the solution to something and it never works. I'm not a solution. I'm a person. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I know you're a person. I knew it on that platform in Dry Creek. That's why He stopped. Tried again. I've spent 2 years telling myself that the best thing I could do for my children was manage, keep the ranch running, keep things stable. I told myself that was enough, that wanting more than that was self-indulgent, ungrateful for what I still had. That sounds very reasonable and very lonely, she said. It was, he said, without particular drama. It was both of those things. She let that sit for a moment. Wyatt, she said, what is it you're actually trying to say? He looked at her with those pale, tired eyes that had been less tired lately, she had noticed. Incrementally, over weeks, less tired. I'm trying to say, he said carefully, that you are not an obligation. You are not a debt I'm repaying or a problem I solved or a function this ranch required. He stopped, as if checking the accuracy of what he was about to say. You are the first person in 2 years who has made me feel like the thing I'm building here is worth something. Not just to the children, to me. The room was very quiet. She had told herself she was a practical person. She had told herself practical people did not set too much store by moments. And yet here was this moment, substantial and present, and she was sitting in it. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I already told you that. I remember, but I want to be clear about something. She held his gaze. If I stay, and I mean stay, not just work here, not just manage the house, it's because I'm choosing to, not because I have nowhere else to go, not because of what you paid, not because of the county, not because of any of the circumstances that brought me here, me choosing. That has to be what it is. Yes, he said. That's what I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment. Then I'm choosing, she said. He breathed out, just slightly, not dramatically, not like a man swept away, but like a man who has been holding something and has just been told he can put it down. All right, he said. All right, she said. She had not expected the relief of it. Having said the thing, having let it out of the careful space she'd been keeping it in, The relief of that was more substantial than she'd prepared for, and it did something to the quality of the next few days that she noticed and could not quite resist. She moved differently through the ranch. Not changed, not transformed. She was still herself, still doing the same work in the same order, but there was something lighter in it, something that had put down a weight she'd been carrying without fully acknowledging its existence. She caught herself humming once in the kitchen and stopped, and then thought, why stop? And started again. Abigail heard her one morning and appeared in the doorway. You're humming, she said. Yes. Abigail studied her for a moment with the assessment eyes. Good, she said, and went to do her chores. Eli said nothing about it. But that same week he finished a long entry in his notebook about the crow behavior he'd been observing at the east fence, and he brought it to her to read, and at the end it said, in his cramped writing, EH suggested parallel with migratory delay, worth considering. She had made that observation 3 weeks ago in passing. He had kept it and put it in his records with her initials, the way you credit a source. She read it twice and said nothing about it. Jarse. The change between her and Wyatt was not dramatic in the way that changes in stories were sometimes described. There was no single moment that rearranged everything. It was more like the way the light changes in November, gradually, by degrees, and you don't notice each individual shift until you look up one day and realize the quality of it is completely different from what it was. He sought her out more. Not obviously, not with any performance of it, but he found reasons to be in the same space, at the kitchen table in the evenings with some piece of ranch business that could have waited until morning, on the porch after supper when the cold should have sent him inside. He talked more than he had in the first months. Not constantly. He was still a man who believed words should carry their weight, but there was a loosening in him, a gradual willingness to speak the whole thought rather than just the useful portion of it. She found she liked the whole thought. She found she liked the version of him that was willing to be exasperated, that would say, Pete is absolutely wrong about the East pasture, and I'm not going to tell him that to his face, in a tone that meant he found Pete's wrongness affectionate rather than irritating. The version that admitted he'd tried to bake once while she was in town and produced something so dense that Cord had used it as a doorstop. The version that watched his children when they didn't know he was watching them with the love so straightforward it had nowhere to hide. One evening, she found him in the barn after supper, not doing anything particular, just running a brush over one of the mares with the meditative repetition of someone who needs something to do with his hands while he thinks. She sat on the hay bale near the stall and didn't say anything. After a while, he said, You know what tomorrow is? She had been counting forward from the auction. She had known for a week. 3 months? She said. 3 months? He said. The brush kept moving. The mare stood patient. When I brought you home, he said, I had a plan. Not much of one. Someone to manage the house, look after the children, keep things running until I worked out something better. That was it. He glanced at her. That was a very incomplete plan. You could not have planned for this, she said. No, he agreed. I really couldn't have. She looked at the rafters of the barn. Up near the top, a bird had made a nest in the corner. She'd noticed it weeks ago, empty now in the winter, but the structure of it still there, patient and exact. Can I tell you something? She said. You can tell me anything. When I was standing on that platform, she said, I was trying to find something to look at that wasn't the crowd. I kept looking at the sky. There was nothing interesting happening in the sky. It was just blue. She paused. I remember thinking, this is the lowest point. Whatever comes next, this is the lowest I'll go. I was trying to use it like a landmark, so I could say later, that was the bottom, and I came up from there. He had stopped brushing. He was looking at her. And, he said, and I came up from there, she said. That's all. I just wanted to say it out loud. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he set the brush down on the edge of the stall and crossed the short distance between them, and he sat down beside her on the hay bale, close, not quite touching. And he didn't do anything dramatic. He just sat there. After a moment, his hand moved and found hers, and he held it simply, without ceremony. Her first instinct was to pull back, because her first instinct about most things involving vulnerability was to pull back. She had a very reliable first instinct in that direction. She let it pass and kept her hand where it was. I'm glad it was me, he said. At the auction, I'm glad I was the one who went. So am I, she said. Most days. She felt him almost smile. Most days. I have an honest nature, she said. I know. He did smile then, or as close to it as he usually got, the slight deepening at the corner of his mouth, the change in his eyes. I knew it in about the first hour. They sat in the barn with the cold outside and the warmth of the animals around them, and his hand over hers. And it was not a perfect moment, because no moment involving two imperfect people could be perfect. And there was still the question of what this became from here, what it looked like properly, what it meant in practical terms in a small frontier town that had already had plenty of opinions about both of them. All of that was real and would have to be dealt with. But right now there was just this, the barn, the cold, the mare's slow breathing, and the feeling of having arrived somewhere. She told Abigail first, not formally, not as an announcement. She was in the kitchen the following morning, and Abigail was at the table, and she simply said, while she was working, "Your father and I have been talking about what this arrangement is, going forward." Abigail put down her pencil. "What did you decide?" she asked. "That I'm staying," Evelyn said. "Properly staying." Abigail was quiet for a moment. She looked at her paper. Then she said, "I already told Eli 2 weeks ago that you were going to." Evelyn turned. "You did?" "It was obvious," Abigail said. "You stopped looking like someone waiting to leave. People have a look when they're waiting to leave. You lost it around October." "You noticed in October." "I notice things," Abigail said, with the equanimity of someone who has always noticed things and has stopped pretending otherwise. Evelyn stood there for a moment, then turned back to the stove. "What did Eli say?" "He said it was statistically probable." A pause. "That means he was glad." "I know what it means." She heard Abigail pick up her pencil again. Then, "You're not trying to be her." "No," Evelyn said. "We talked about that." "I know. I'm just saying it again." Another pause. "I want you to know I don't need you to be. I know who you are. You're the person who stayed awake for 3 days and who lets me show her things, and who asks Eli real questions instead of nice ones." Her voice was very even, very careful. "That's who you are to us. That's enough." Evelyn kept her back to Abigail for a moment longer than necessary, getting something under control. "Thank you," she said finally. "You're welcome," Abigail said, and went back to her drawing. Eli was, as Abigail had predicted, statistically probable about it. He looked at Evelyn when she mentioned it to him that afternoon in the oblique, angled way she'd learned to approach him, not head-on but from the side, as if the conversation were about something adjacent to what it was actually about. And he said, after a pause, "I figured." "Did you?" "You care about the land," he said. "People who care about the land don't leave it." He said this with the authority of someone who has observed this principle in nature. It's like the crows at the east fence. They're not supposed to winter there, but they've got something there they don't want to leave, so they're recalibrating their pattern. He met her eyes briefly. "That's what you did." She considered that. "I recalibrated my pattern." "Yes," he said, as if this were obvious. "Thank you, Eli," she said. He shrugged, picking up his notebook. "You asked Abby first," he said, and she couldn't tell if it was an accusation or an observation. "She was in the kitchen," Evelyn said. He said. Not satisfied, not dissatisfied, just processing. She let him process. Pete, when he heard, through the specific channels of ranch communication that meant everyone knew everything within a day of it happening, found her at the water trough the following morning, where she was checking the heating mechanism they'd rigged to keep it from freezing solid. He stood beside her and looked at the trough and said, without preamble, "He's a better man than most, not perfect." "I know," she said. "He'll close up sometimes. Goes quiet for days when something bothers him and you can't get at it. I've noticed. You'll need patience." "I have some," she said. "Not infinite. I'll manage." Pete nodded at the trough. "The coil on the left needs adjusting." She adjusted it. "You're good for this place," he said. Not warmly, not gushingly, just the plain assessment of a man who had been watching things on this ranch for a very long time. Better than he knew when he went to Dry Creek to get you. I know, she said again. Good, he said. Don't let him forget it. He went back to work, and she went back to the trough. And that was that. It snowed that night. Not a serious snow, not the kind Pete's bones predicted were still coming later in the season, but a real snow, the kind that covers the ground and changes the quality of the morning, the way sound moves differently, and everything looks cleaner than it actually is. She stood at the kitchen window while the fire was building and looked at the yard gone white, and the fencing gone white, and the barn roof gone white, and beyond all of it, the open country running out under a sky that was doing something complicated with the light. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Then another set. The children were never far apart in the mornings. Then, further behind, the unhurried sound of Wyatt. She heard all of them coming toward the kitchen, each one distinct, each one a sound she knew now, and she turned to start the coffee. The morning needed doing. The ranch was there, and the snow, and the work, and these people coming down the stairs to the kitchen she had made her own. She did not think too much about how far she'd come from the auction platform in Dry Creek. She thought about the coffee and the accounts and the fact that Eli had noticed the coil needed adjusting before she had and said nothing about it, and whether she should let that go or use it as a teaching moment. She decided to let it go. Some things you let go. Some things you hold. The trick was learning which was which, and she was still learning, same as everyone else, same as it had always been. She started the coffee. The kitchen filled. The morning began. Winter on the frontier is not a season so much as a reckoning. It strips everything down to what it actually is. No green to soften the fences, no heat to make the distances feel manageable, no forgiving light to make the land look better than it is. What's solid stays. What was only appearing solid tends to show itself for what it was all along. Evelyn had grown up knowing this about winter, and she had come to think of it as the most honest time of year, even if honest and comfortable were rarely the same thing. The Mercer Ranch in December was solid. She knew that now in the specific, tested way of someone who had watched it through the worst of autumn. The illness, the fear, the long nights, and seen it hold. Not without cost, not without damage, but hold. The work didn't stop because of decisions made in barns and kitchens. If anything, the work increased, the way it always did in winter when the cold created new problems faster than you could solve the old ones. Water lines needed checking. Feed needed managing against the count of what remained and what the animals required. The bunkhouse had a draft coming through the north wall that Dex had been complaining about for weeks, and that finally required actual attention rather than the creative blanket solutions he'd been employing. Evelyn found herself in the first weeks of December doing 3 people's work most days. And she did it without resentment because it was hers to do, and she had never been afraid of her own work. But something was different in how she did it now. She had noticed this herself, examined it carefully to make sure she was seeing it accurately and not just telling herself a flattering story. What was different was this. She was no longer working to prove something. For the first months, he said she could see this clearly in retrospect. Every task had carried a secondary weight. Every completed chore was also an argument. Every handled problem was also a statement. I am worth keeping. I am worth the space I take up. I am more than what that auction platform made me. She didn't need to make that argument anymore. Not because anyone had officially declared the case closed, but because she had closed it herself, internally, somewhere between the hallway outside the children's rooms at 3 in the morning and the barn conversation, and Abigail's voice saying that's enough with more precision and more grace than most adults could manage. The work was just work now. Good work. Necessary work. Work she was competent at. That was sufficient. So, Wyatt asked her to marry him on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December, which was not a romantic day by anyone's accounting. She was in the middle of reorganizing the cellar inventory, which was a job she'd been putting off for weeks because the cellar was cold, and the organization system it had developed over the years was genuinely bewildering. He came down the cellar stairs with a lantern because the light below was poor, and she was on her knees in front of a shelf reading labels, and he stood at the bottom of the stairs and said, "I want to ask you something." She looked up. He was holding the lantern in a way that made the light move, and she could see his face well enough. "All right," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. Not will you, was just the statement of it, plain and direct, the way he did most things that mattered to him. I've been trying to work out a better way to say that for 2 weeks, and I don't have one. That's what it is. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. You're asking me in the cellar, she said. You're in the cellar, he said. I've been waiting for you to be somewhere more. And then I thought, she's not going to care about where. She's going to care about whether I mean it. Do you mean it? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Not uncertain. She knew her answer. But she wanted to sit inside the question for a second, to actually feel the weight of it, because this was not a small thing, and she had learned the hard way that treating small things as large and large things as small was how you ended up lost. What does that look like? She said. Practically, in this town. You know what people will say. I know what they'll say, he said. I don't especially care. I do, she said. A little. Not enough to change my answer, but I want to be honest about it. What's your answer? Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. But I want us to both walk into Dry Creek with our eyes open, because it's going to be a conversation for a while, and I'd rather we agree on how we carry it before it starts. He came down off the last stair and crouched down in front of her, which brought him to her level, lantern and all. He was close enough that she could see the detail of him. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the gray that was starting to come through at his temples, the expression on his face that was the most unguarded she had seen it. I'll carry it however you need, he said. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. All right, he said. Now let me finish the inventory, she said. I'm in the middle of trying to understand what your system was down here, and I think the answer is that there wasn't one. He stood back up. There wasn't, he agreed. That's what I thought. He went back up the stairs. She heard him in the kitchen above her, moving around, and there was something in the ordinary sound of it. His footsteps on the floor over her head, the familiar creak of the chair, that she felt somewhere in her chest as the particular warmth of things falling into their right places. She told Abigail and Eli together at the kitchen table after supper that same evening, in the same matter-of-fact way she'd told them other things. Without ceremony, without dramatics, because she had learned that both children responded better to things delivered plainly than to things wrapped in significance. Your father asked me to marry him today, she said. Abigail looked up from the drawing she'd been working on. Eli, who had been reading, kept looking at his book for exactly 2 seconds, which was the delay between hearing something and pretending you hadn't reacted to it. In the cellar, Wyatt said from the doorway, with what passed for him as dry humor. What did you say? Abigail asked, looking at Evelyn. Yes. Abigail nodded, once, decisive. Good, she said, and went back to her drawing. Eli put his book down. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her, then at his father, then at some point in the middle distance that represented his thinking. Then, does this change anything about the arrangement with the accounts? Wyatt made a sound. It took her a moment to identify it as a suppressed laugh. No, she said. The accounts stay the same. Good, Eli said. They're better now. I don't want them changed. He picked up his book. She looked at the top of his head for a moment, at the dark hair that was overdue a cut, at the way he held the book closer to his face than he needed to because he didn't like admitting the light was insufficient. She thought about a 12-year-old boy who had put a snake in a previous caretaker's bed and told the ranch hands she'd touched his mother's preserves and showed up at her door 2 weeks later with a notebook about birds. She thought, whatever else happens, I did right by this one, both of them. Whatever else I get wrong going forward, I got that right. The wedding was in February. Not because February was anyone's idea of a romantic month on the frontier. It wasn't. It was gray and relentless and cold in the specific way of a cold that has been going on long enough to feel personal, but because February was when the work had a natural lull, the brief window between the hardest of the winter work and the start of the spring preparations, when you could take 2 days off the ranch without it costing you something significant. She had not wanted a large event. She had said this clearly, and Wyatt had agreed with the relief of a man who also had no particular appetite for spectacle. What they had agreed on was something modest, the county clerk in Dry Creek, the paperwork, and then a meal at the ranch for the people who mattered. What they had not entirely accounted for was Dry Creek itself. The town had opinions about Evelyn Hart. She had understood this was likely, had prepared herself for it, had even tried to prepare Wyatt for it, and yet the reality of walking into Dry Creek on a February morning with Wyatt Mercer beside her was something that preparation could only partially address. She had been there a handful of times since the auction, for supplies, for the doctor's visits during the illness, and each time she had felt the town's awareness of her as a particular kind of pressure, the weight of being recognized as the girl from the auction platform, being filed in the category of people the town had collectively decided something about. This time was different, and she knew it would be different before they pulled the wagon to a stop on Main Street. Different because she was not arriving alone, not arriving as someone else's property, or problem, or arrangement. She was arriving beside a man, which on the frontier in February was read in one way and one way only, and the town would be reading it before she stepped down from the wagon. She stepped down from the wagon. Wyatt was beside her, and his hand was briefly at her elbow. Not possessively, not as guidance, just there. And she stood in the main street of Dry Creek in her best dress, which was not her mother's dress this time, but a blue wool one she had made herself in November with Clara's help. And she looked at the town, and the town looked back. Mrs. Harlan, from the dry goods store, was on the boardwalk across the street. Evelyn knew her slightly, had dealt with her on supply runs, found her to be a practical woman with a direct manner and a fairly accurate sense of what was worth her attention. Mrs. Harlan looked at her and then at Wyatt and then back at her, and then she nodded. A real nod, not a polite one, the kind that meant something. Old Sorensen, who ran the feed store beside whose lot the auction had been held, was opening his doors, and he stopped when he saw them and looked for a long moment. She did not know what he was thinking. She held herself level and did not look away. And after a moment he went back to opening his doors. "All right," Wyatt said, low. "All right," she said. The county clerk was a man named Briggs, who had clearly been doing this for a long time and had long since reached the point where he processed the event rather than participated in it. He went through the paperwork with brisk efficiency and had them sign where they needed to sign and witnessed where he needed to witness, and when it was done he looked up and said, "That's the lot of it," in the tone of a man who had just filed something properly. "Thank you," Evelyn said. He looked at her over his glasses. Then he said, unexpectedly, "I remember you. From August." She met his eyes. "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment. "I'll say now what I should have said then," he said. "That was a poor business, what the county arranged. I didn't make it happen, and I didn't stop it, which amounts to the same thing." He went back to his papers. "Congratulations to you both." She was quiet for a second. "Thank you," she said again, and meant it differently this time. Outside in the street, she stood in the winter light and took a breath that came out visible in the cold air. "All right," Wyatt said for the second time. "That was unexpected," she said. "Briggs is a decent man, just slow." "Most people are," she said. "Slow." He looked at her with a slight tilt of his head. "I'm not angry at them," she said, because she could see the question forming. "Not anymore." Or, "I'm still a little angry. I think that's going to be a permanent condition, but it's not at them specifically. It's more at the arrangement of things. The way the world is built so that when something goes wrong, it's always the person with the least to lose who falls the furthest." "Your father's debts," he said. "The fact that his debts became my body," she said. "That's what I'm angry at. The system that said that was a reasonable solution." She looked at the street, the ordinary February morning of it. "I could be angry at that for the rest of my life and be completely justified, but I don't want it to be what I carry. I've got other things to carry that are better." He was quiet. "What do you carry?" she asked. "That's better." He thought about it. "The North Pasture in May," he said, "when everything's coming up. The sound of the twins arguing about something that doesn't matter." He looked at her. "You. In the kitchen at 6 in the morning when you think nobody's watching." She felt something warm move through her chest. "I'm always watching for people watching," she said. "I know," he said. "You're not always right about who is." The meal at the ranch that afternoon was the people who mattered, Claire and Pete, Cord and Samuel and Dex, who cleaned up for the occasion with varying degrees of success. Calloway came, which surprised her. She hadn't known Wyatt had invited him until the buggy appeared at the end of the drive, but she was glad, because she thought of him as someone who had been present in the important hours and that meant something. Abigail had been in the kitchen with Clara for 2 days. Evelyn had been firmly excluded. The results of this were a table set with more care than she had seen it set since she arrived, and food that was genuinely excellent, and Abigail standing at the head of the table with the particular bearing of someone who has completed a project and knows it's good. "You made most of this," Evelyn said. "Clara made most of it," Abigail said. "I made the bread." Evelyn looked at the bread. It was good bread, properly risen, properly browned, the crust cracking in the way that meant the inside would be right. "Did you fold it?" she said. "Of course I folded it," Abigail said. Eli, taking his seat, said, "She made me smell it at every stage. I have opinions about bread now that I didn't want." "You're welcome," Abigail said. Evelyn sat down at this table, her table now, in all the ways that counted, and looked at the people around it. Pete with his weathered face and his minimal expressions. Clara refilling things before they needed refilling. Cord already talking to Dex about something that was probably not serious. Samuel, quiet at the end, eating with the appreciation of a man who knows good food and doesn't waste it. Calloway, who had come 12 miles in February and seemed to think this was a reasonable thing to do. Abigail sitting straight, watching the table with the satisfaction of someone monitoring their work. Eli, who had already taken a piece of bread and was reading something under the table edge that he was trying to hide and not succeeding. And Wyatt, at the other end of the table, who caught her eye across the length of it and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. She thought, "I built this. Not alone. Nothing worth having is built alone. But I built it. Out of a morning in August when I had nothing and stood in a dirt lot and refused to be nothing." She thought about her father. She thought about him the way she had learned to think about him. Without the gutting grief of the first months, with something that had become gradually a kind of complicated tenderness. He had been a man who dreamed badly and loved her well, and the combination of those two things had cost her more than it should have. She didn't need to pretend otherwise, but she also didn't need to let the cost be the last word on who he was to her. She hoped, wherever he had gone, he could see this table. Not because she needed his approval. She had learned, finally, that she never had, but because she thought he would have loved it. He would have loved the noise and the argument over who made what, and Clara's expression when Cord reached over someone to get the salt, and Eli trying to read secretly. He would have loved all of it. She raised her glass. Everyone raised theirs somewhat irregularly, at different speeds. "To the ranch," she said, because she couldn't think of anything that covered more of what she meant. "To the ranch," said the table, and drank. Spring, when it came gradually, and then all at once, which is the only way spring ever comes anywhere. The first sign was the ground, softening after the long freeze. Then the creek running higher than it had in months, and Abigail going to her rock to sit by the water with a frequency that told Evelyn the girl had her own relationship with the turning seasons. Then Eli's birds returning to the east fence, not the crows, who had wintered stubbornly against all ornithological expectation, but others, the ones that meant the season was changing, and Eli marking each arrival in his notebook with the gravity of someone keeping official records, which was exactly what he believed he was doing. The kitchen garden Evelyn had put in the previous August had been a trial run. The spring one was the real thing. She had spent part of the winter planning it with the accounts book open beside her, thinking about what the ranch could use and what the soil would support and what she actually knew how to grow. She had argued with herself about the scale of it and then decided to go larger rather than smaller because the worst outcome was too much of something useful, which was not a problem she had much sympathy for. Abigail helped. Not every day, not with any obligation about it, but she would appear beside Evelyn in the morning when the weather was good and work beside her with a focus that was her natural mode. Precise, serious, not chatty. They didn't talk much when they gardened. They had gotten very comfortable with each other's silence over the winter. It had become one of the things Evelyn valued most about Abigail. The girl could be quiet in a room without making you feel the silence was an accusation. One morning in late April, they were on their knees planting the beans, which needed to go in early before the last cold risk was fully passed, which meant accepting that some of them might not make it and planting anyway. And Abigail said, without looking up, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if it wasn't him? At the auction?" Evelyn considered the question. "Yes," she said. "The man with the fence," Abigail said. I heard Father tell Pete about it once, that there was a man who might have won. There was. Abigail pressed a seed into the ground. What would you have done? I don't know, Evelyn said. Managed, figured something out. She tamped the soil over the seed. People do. When they have to, they figure something out. But you wouldn't be here. No, she said. I wouldn't. Abigail was quiet for a moment. I didn't want you here at first. I know. I was wrong. You weren't wrong to be cautious, Evelyn said. The people who'd come before me left. You had good reasons to expect the same. That's generous. It's accurate. She moved along the row. You were protecting yourself. That's not the same as being wrong. Abigail looked at her. She had her father's eyes. Evelyn had come to see. Not the color, which was darker, but the quality of the look, the assessing patience of it. Do you still feel like you're protecting yourself? Abigail asked. From here. From us. Evelyn thought about it honestly. Less, she said. There are still things I don't say because I haven't decided whether they need saying. That's probably a permanent trait. But the protecting from you specifically, she shook her head. No, I stopped needing that somewhere around the bread. Abigail's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, not yet, but it was the territory adjacent to it. The bread was a test, she said. I know it was a test. You passed. I know I passed. You showed me the folding. Abigail finally smiled, fully, which she did infrequently enough that each time felt like catching something. I showed you the folding because I decided to let you pass, she said. It was my test. I decided the outcome. Evelyn looked at her. Is that so? Yes, Abigail said with complete equanimity. Evelyn turned back to the beans. Well, she said, thank you for grading fairly. Abigail laughed, an actual laugh, quick and unguarded, and went back to planting, and they worked in companionable quiet for the rest of the morning with the spring sun doing its slow, honest work on the soil between them. Eli came to her one evening in May with his notebook, the original one, the one he'd shown her in the loft on the night she'd climbed up and stayed for 2 hours. It was more full than it had been then, the pages dense with months of additional observation. I want to send this somewhere, he said. She looked at him. Which part? The migration timing data, he said. There's a natural science journal. I found the address in one of Father's periodicals. He held the notebook without opening it. I know I'm 12. I know they probably won't. He stopped, started again. I want to try anyway. She thought about a boy who had written to the dead author of a book to argue with his conclusions. She thought about how much of who a person was showed up early, in small actions that seemed minor at the time and turned out to be everything. Let's write the letter together, she said. Tonight, if you want. He looked at her. You know how to write to a journal? I know how to write a letter that sounds like it should be taken seriously, she said, which is what you need. You don't think they'll dismiss it because of my age? I think you don't have to mention your age in the first letter, she said. Let the data speak first. If they respond, you can tell them then. He considered this. She could see the ethical negotiation going on behind his eyes, the tension between the pragmatic strategy and his instinct for complete disclosure. It's not a lie, she said. You'd just be leading with the most relevant information. The data, he said. The data, he decided. Tonight, he said, and went to get his pen. They wrote the letter at the kitchen table after supper, Eli dictating the data and the argument and her helping him shape it into the kind of language that did what it needed to do without being either too formal or too young-sounding. It took 2 hours. He rewrote the final version himself, carefully, in his cramped but legible hand. He did not mention he was 12. He signed it E. Mercer, which was technically complete. They sent it the following week. 3 months later, in August, a letter came back. She was the one who saw it first, in the mail Cord brought from Dry Creek, and she recognized the journal's name on the envelope, and she set it on the table and went to find Eli without opening it, because it was his letter. He opened it with the particular stillness of someone who is afraid of what they're about to find out. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his face. He read it twice. She could tell by the way his eyes moved. Then he looked up. They want more data, he said. They say the preliminary observations are, they said, of genuine interest. He looked back at the letter. They want the full 2 years. She felt something open in her chest. Then send them the full 2 years, she said. He looked at her across the kitchen with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful neutrality, not the testing watchfulness, not the armored intelligence he usually carried. Just a 12-year-old boy who had been told that the thing he saw was real and worth seeing. Okay, he said, just that. She went back to what she was doing. She did not make a scene of it. She knew that what Eli needed was for this to be treated as a beginning rather than an arrival, because that's what it was, and he knew it too, and the worst thing she could do was make it smaller by making too much of it. She made a note to tell Wyatt when they were alone. She thought about telling him casually while they were doing something else, because that was how they did things best. The important conversations that happened alongside the ordinary ones. The way the truth tends to surface most easily when nobody is staring directly at it. Summer came with the particular authority of frontier summers, unambiguous, hot, and long. And the kitchen garden that she had planned through February and planted in April was by July more productive than she had estimated. This was both a satisfaction and a logistical problem. She had rows of beans that needed picking every 2 days and squash that seemed to double in size overnight, and tomatoes that were arriving faster than any 4 people and a rotating crew of ranch hands could reasonably use. She spent 3 evenings putting things up, preserving, pickling, the hot, painstaking work of turning summer abundance into winter supply. And Abigail worked beside her for all of it with the focused competence she brought to everything she decided was worth her time. Clara came on one of those evenings and looked at the jars already done and the work still remaining and said, "You're going to need more lids." And Evelyn said, "I know, I underestimated." And Clara said, without malice, "You'll know better next year." And that was that. Next year. She had a next year here now, and the year after, and the one after that. She had thought once that belonging to a place was something that happened to you, something granted by circumstance or birth or luck. That was what she had believed watching her father's homestead be sold off piece by piece, that belonging could be taken, that it was always provisional, always subject to the conditions of whoever held the deed. She understood now that she had been half right. Belonging could be taken if it was the kind that depended on other people's permission. But there was another kind. The kind you built with your hands and your decisions and your willingness to stay when staying was hard. That kind couldn't be auctioned, couldn't be inherited or lost with a deed. It lived in what you knew about a place, which stair creaked, which field drained poorly, which child needed to approach things from the side, and which one needed them head on. It lived in the work you'd done, and the seasons you'd been through, and the people you'd sat with in the dark. Nobody could sell that at a platform in Dry Creek. She thought about this on a July evening when the work was done and the kitchen was clean, and the children were somewhere on the property doing whatever children did in summer evenings when the light lasted long past supper. She was sitting on the porch in the chair that faced west, the one she'd sat in on her first evening when she'd heard Wyatt's boots coming in from the barn and had her first real conversation with him. He came in from the barn now, the same way he always did, and he stopped when he saw her on the porch, and he leaned against the post, the same post he'd leaned against that first evening. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she said. "Clara says I'll know better next year about the tomatoes." "She told me the same thing about the south fence in 1879, he said. She was right. She usually is. He looked out at the property going gold in the late light. She had learned to read his silences now the way Pete read the sky, not with instruments, but with accumulated attention. This one was the comfortable kind, the kind that wasn't waiting for anything. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "August," he said. "What about it?" "Year ago August," he said. "I drove to Dry Creek, and I wasn't sure I was going to go through with it. I sat in the wagon outside the feed store for 10 minutes, arguing with myself." "What convinced you?" "You were already up there when I came around the corner," he said. "I saw your face before you saw me." A pause. "You were furious. You were standing there in that dress, and you were furious, and trying not to show it, which meant it was all showing anyway." He looked at her. "I thought, whoever she is, she's going to be fine. Whatever happens to her, she's going to be fine, but she shouldn't have to do it alone." She held his gaze. "I was terrified," she said. Not just furious, both. "I know," he said. "I could see that too." "You didn't show that you saw it." "No," he said. "I thought you'd rather I didn't." She thought about that, about how right he had been, and how strange it was that a man she hadn't known existed 6 months before that had read her correctly on first sight in a dirt lot in Dry Creek. "Wyatt," she said. "I want to say something, and I want you to just let me say it without responding." He looked at her steadily. "All right. I was 18 years old on that platform," she said. "I just lost everything I knew. I had no idea what kind of man you were. I thought the best I could do was survive whatever came next and look for a way out eventually." She paused. "I want you to know, I need you to know, that what I have now is not what I was trying to survive toward. I could not have imagined this. I didn't have the material to imagine it. A ranch that felt like mine. Children I'd walk through fire for without thinking about it. You." She stopped. "I'm not saying it's easy or perfect, because it isn't, and I won't pretend otherwise. I'm saying it's real, and it's mine, and I chose it." He had let her say it. He had listened with that absolute attention of his. Then he said simply, "I know. I know you know," she said. "I wanted to say it anyway." "You can say it as many times as you want," he said. "I probably won't say it more than once," she said. "It's said." "Then it's said," he agreed. They sat on the porch, him leaning on the post, her in her chair, and watched the sun go down over the frontier in its unhurried, spectacular way that it did every evening regardless of what the day had held, good or bad, simple or impossible. The light went gold and then orange, and then the particular deep red that preceded the violet gray, and the land went through all of it, patient and enormous. From somewhere east of the barn, she heard Eli's voice, calling to Abigail about something, too far to make out the words, but the tone unmistakable. Eli calling his sister the way he'd been calling her since they were born, with the assumption of being heard, of being part of a pair. Abigail's voice called back. Then silence. Then, a minute later, both of them coming around the corner of the barn in the low light, walking together with the unself-conscious synchrony of twins who have been each other's company so long they've stopped noticing they match. And Evelyn watched them cross the yard, and she thought about what Eli had said once about the crows at the east fence. They've got something there they don't want to leave. So they're recalibrating their pattern. She had recalibrated. She was still recalibrating because that was the nature of a life. Not a fixed point, but a continuous adjustment. The ongoing work of becoming who you were going to be. She did not know what the next year would hold, or the one after. She knew there would be bad seasons and hard winters, and things that broke and needed to be fixed, and arguments that went on too long, and moments when she would be wrong and have to say so, and moments when she would be right and have to wait while other people caught up. She knew she would be here for all of it. The children came up to the porch, trailing the last of the evening light behind them. Abigail looked at Evelyn in the chair and at Wyatt at the post, and at the way the air was between them, and said nothing, which meant she understood everything. Eli looked at the western sky and said, "Red sky at night," and then didn't finish the saying, because anyone who had been on the frontier long enough knew the rest of it without being told. Good weather coming. Not guaranteed, but nothing was guaranteed, but likely. Probable. She looked at Wyatt. He looked at her. "Come inside," she said to the children. "I'll make something." "What?" Eli said. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'll figure it out." She got up from the chair and went inside, and behind her she heard Abigail follow, and Eli's boots on the steps, and last of all Wyatt, pulling the door closed against the evening. The kitchen was warm. The lamp was lit. The accounts book was on the table where she'd left it, and the garden was full and the cellar was stocked, and the property was solid under the first stars. She had come here with nothing, to a place she didn't choose, to a family that didn't want her. She had stayed anyway, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had decided that staying was worth more than whatever leaving might have offered. That was the thing, she thought, setting the pan on the stove and reaching for what she needed. That was the thing nobody told you, or maybe they told you and you couldn't hear it until you'd lived it. Belonging wasn't a place you arrived at. It was a direction you kept choosing. Every day, in small decisions and difficult ones, in the work you did and the people you stayed for, and the things you refused to let define you. She had been sold. She had been reduced to a number on a board in a dirt lot. And she had chosen, with everything she had and everything she'd learned, to become something that could not be priced or auctioned or taken. The stove was warm. The family was here. She started cooking.